We cannot let them make martyrs of the people who mine and ferment and die. The truth will kill them all if Shen knew it whole. But neither can we let the recipes die. We have to shape a way. He stopped and huffed a breath. It was Lai Wei who pushed the shape into words. We will make a case in ritual, he said. We will show that certain colors are bound to ceremony, that their use is not to inflame, but to recall rulers to their lineage. We will pull from the archives and create precedent. The Grand Secretary respects precedent. He fears breaking the Book of Ages more than he fears a painted face. He is not made of ink, Mei Lin answered. He is made of mourning. He will not be moved by precedents if he sees fervor. Lai Wei smiled with a sadness that was almost fondness. We will not give him fervor. We will give him protocol and the scaffold of ritual. We will make the act of painting less revolutionary and more necessary to the circumscribed order he keeps. If we do this without fanfare, if we wrote things through official petitions, he tapped his temple as if his slow mind could drive a nail into the day's fears. Then perhaps some will see the pigments as part of the palace's grammar. Mei Lin felt the logic like a cold draft. She had always believed craft could be separate from politics. Now she found she had to learn not only to mix color, but to pass the brittle grammar of the court. She agreed to Lai Wei's plan, though a small part of her suspected it would not be enough. Plans could be chewed by suspicion as a goat chews cud. They refined protocol, who would carry what, how objects would be catalogued, what phrases would be used if asked, how to hide the telltale smell of fermented mordants, how to create plausible false inventories that satisfied cursory inspection but kept the truth intact. Apprentice Xun learned to wrap and to fold with speed. Mei Lin taught him to think of each parcel as both cargo and story, an object that had to carry past weight and present meaning without collapsing under scrutiny. The changes made the work more tedious and more exacting. At night they painted under lanterns, whose flame they shaded with paper to keep smoke from rising to the latticed eaves, and they named their hours by the stars. They scheduled shipments for rainier days, so that the scent of the sea would camouflage the mineral tang. All these details made the trade feel less like art, and more like a weather map of evasion. Yet even as their methods hardened, so did the public friction the court felt. Shen's inspectors began to move through districts with a new arrogance. Their boots came earlier and their lists grew longer. Madame Zhou took chances to test a banner along the outer markets. She sent it down a lane on a whisper, and it returned to the weavers with an added thread of red that no one could trace. The sight of that red on a storefront lifted a tenor of courage in the small traders. A child danced briefly in the lane, and the woman behind him laughed so clearly that nearby shutters twitched. That laughter was both victory and risk. Shen's men heard it. They wrote down the lane, they checked merchant ledgers, they questioned porters. A porter noted seeing a strange wrapped parcel. A young apprentice in a remote workshop, someone other than Xun, spoke too loudly of seeing beautiful blues, and was warned with a folded sheet of paper that read, "Silence keeps our hands whole." Mei Lin folded into the new economy of secrecy with a kind of steady sorrow. Each success demanded a calculus. Who could be trusted? What could be risked? How much of the earth would be stripped for a single revived memory? On some nights she dreamed of the southern atelier she had never seen but had imagined from the scrap of silk sewn into her grandmother's hem. She dreamt it not as a place of simple beauty, but as a place where craft and survival braided into a hard, stubborn life. She painted by those memories and felt them dissipate into the ledger of obligation. The chapter's last night found Mei Lin sitting at Jiao's bench, the lamp guttering as if listening. They had just wrapped a scholar's fan whose restored sky had been turned over to a teacher in the outer gardens. Lai Wei had whispered the gift into a petition for ritual exemption. The fan would be used in a small memorial rite in a private hall, an experiment in Lai Wei's policy. The fan's owner had sent a note of thanks, an old couplet copied in shaky hand that read, Color returns the lost syllables. Outside, near the salt road, a procession of courier feet struck the hard-packed lane. For a moment their cadence sounded like a measured heart. Then there was a softer sound, an unfamiliar boot that did not belong to Zhao's hired carrier but to the palace inspectors. Mei Lin's throat tightened. The lamp's flame seemed to shiver. "They come earlier every day," Zhao said. His voice had the tired edge of one who had burned too many midnight kilns. "We cannot keep out of their sight forever." Mei Lin closed her ledger and slipped it beneath a loose board. The ledger's pages made a quiet rustle, like the sound of a pretty animal's breath. "Then we choose meaning," she said. "If we cannot save everything, we will save the things that make memory possible." A knock sounded on Jiao's outer door, 3 sharp measures. For a second everyone in the room held their breath and waited for the knock to speak. It was a knock that could mean inspection, or it could mean a friend with news, or a courier with a brine-wet jar. In the air between hammer and answer, Mei Lin felt the long tension of the court's silence tighten into something that might snap. Zhao moved to the door, palm flat and slow, as if he had practiced how to open the future. Mei Lin rose with him, her hands cool, her heart a measured drum. She looked once at the small round of blue that gleamed on the porcelain rim, and then at the hidden ledger below the board. The book felt like a promise and a tome. When Zhao unlatched the door, he found a messenger standing under the moon, face masked against the salt. He looked like many messengers, thin, shadowed, and in his hand he held a folded notice. "From the office of the Grand Secretary," the man said. His voice was thin as paper. Zhao took the folded paper with hands that did not tremble outwardly. He slit the seal and read. The words were official, the ink crisp, an increase in audits, samples required, and an order for all workshops supplying palace households to present inventories and exemplars within 3 days. The list ended with a phrase Mei Lin had come to know as absolute: "Non-compliance will be treated as seditious irregularity." The messenger bowed and left like a shadow. Zhao closed the door and turned to Mei Lin. For a long moment neither spoke. The lamp burned low, a small island of light in a sea of night. Beyond the window a gull called twice. Mei Lin felt the ledger's weight in the floor as if the pages beneath had shifted. She thought of the bowl and of the fan and of the schoolmaster who would open his mouth and sing a line that might be remembered for a day. She thought of the men in coastal pits whose fingers dug like geographers. She thought of the children who might be paid in jars of crushed stone. "Prepare," Sun Jiu said at last. "Teach him to talk as we say. Pack the archives. Lai Wei must be ready." Mei Lin folded her hands. The choice ahead felt like a painting she had to execute with both hands tied. The audit could expose their network. It could also be a wedge through which the Grand Secretary might strike. She had hoped her work could be modest, a series of small restorations that would not draw the eye of power. Now power had decided to look. She closed her eyes and thought of her grandmother's hands, of the southern scraps stitched into a hem, of the lullaby a washerwoman would now remember. The law of the court had tightened, but memory was a stubborn thing. Perhaps, she thought, bending to the bench once more, there were ways to make surfaces hold a story so well that even the strictest inspection could not take it away. The lamp hissed and sent a thin smoke spiral up to the rafters. The knock on the door had become the drumbeat to which the next days would live. Outside, the palace slept fitfully, and the world shifted color by careful, dangerous degrees. They gathered their small tools and their larger courage into the night, smoothing the invisible stitches they had sewn. Each action they planned would carry consequence, some immediate, some slow as the leaching of a dye into rainwater. The ledger was slid deeper beneath the board. Laway's scrolls were rolled into oilcloth. Sun was given the first lesson in silence, how to fold his mouth around the truth without letting the truth fall free. When dawn came, it would bring inspectors with their lists and an appetite for answers. When it came, Mei Lin intended to be ready. She did not know whether her small art could confront the heavy logic of men like Shen. She only knew that the work was necessary. She knew color had a way of returning names to faces and faces to selves, that knowledge was both balm and brand. It would mark her as healer to some and as criminal to others. The workshop settled into watchfulness. Somewhere in the palace a harpist tuned, unsure whether the tune would be remembered. The tide had changed its mood, and the court would soon learn whether memory could be defended with brushes and a few handfuls of mineral blue. Outside, the salt road winked in the dark like an omen. The next move would be made under the eye of men who measured safety by what they could control. Mei Lin touched the blue on the porcelain rim as if testing a fever, and the color passed like a whisper across her thumb. She kept it there a long while, feeling its chill and its truth, then wiped it away and began to set plans in motion. The tests had proven the pigments worked. The tensions had proven they had become dangerous by doing their work. The knock had been an invitation and a warning. The court had leaned forward. Mei Lin lifted her brush and started to write a note, careful, brief, and bound to ritual language. The first responders would be sermons of control. Mei Lin's reply would be a quiet proof of why memory needed color. The night around the workshop hummed with the small sounds of men preparing to meet the day, a kettle, the rustle of a cloth, the cracking of a kiln's face as it set. The world had not yet decided whether it would be painted or erased. Outside, in an alley the color of stone, something blue stirred that only a few eyes might see, and for a moment Mei Lin allowed herself a small, private smile. Then she folded the paper and tucked it into her robe. And with Jiao and Li Wei and the apprentice at her side, she stepped toward the morning that held the Grand Secretary's audit like a blade. It was the first test that would decide whether color could continue to be whispered back into the palace like a secret prayer, or whether it would be named a crime and struck like a match. The outer courtyard smelled of dust and frying oil, of the river's mud and the sticky sweetness of candied chrysanthemums. It was a small, slippery stage between the east gate and the poorest of the grain stores, a place where the city's ordinary respirations market calls. The clatter of cartwheels, the scolding of a grandmother met. Mei Lin watched from the low angle of an alley, hands folded at her waist, as if she were waiting for paint to dry, though her heart beat in quicker measures. She had never performed in public like this, never arranged an audience beyond the mute concentration of Zhao's kiln or the quiet of Consort Lion's secluded closet of mementos. She had prepared for privacy. What she had not reckoned with was the theater of hope. Madame Zhou, who smelled of starch and lamp smoke and all the long work of looms, stood beneath the arch that marked the courtyard's entrance. A half-dozen helpers clustered like small birds, their arms full of rolled banners and baskets of repair thread. Madame Zhou's hands were thick with the memory of fingering warp and weft, blunt nails, colices. The small split on the side of a finger from a needle's repeated passage. She moved with a deliberate economy, unrolling the city's municipal banner, as if lifting a sleeping animal into the open. The banner was long and weary, the silk snap flattened by years of wind. Where once a fierce vermilion had flared against lapis, the cloth had settled into a pall of ash and old coffee, but the design dragons, curling clouds, the names of two former governors remained legible like a fossil. Mei Lin stepped forward when Madame Zhou nodded. In public she felt oddly smaller, as if her body belonged to a different scale. Still, her hands remembered the motions, how to steady a brush, how to push pigment into fibers until the color seemed to sink and live. She had chosen a corner of the banner that would not demand a sweeping miracle, a small dragon's eye, and the scale beside it, and she worked from there. The forbidden pigments folded within a leather case wrapped in bamboo bark and mixed into a modest bowl of rice water and glue. The blue, when she first lifted it, was wrong in ordinary ways, too bright, like a recollected sky that had rehearsed its own existence. It was a southern lapis that had once belonged to terraces and temple tiles. Under the dimness of the palace it had been called libation blue, a name whispered in the south and buried in northern ledgers. Here, in the open air, it looked like a thing returned. There was a small band of musicians in the market who had been hired, discreetly, by Madame Jo's friends, one with a reed pipe, another with a small drum, a third who jingled with a set of brass charms. They were told to begin with a low tune and keep their eyes elsewhere, to be part of the ordinary bustle. It was clever the way the human ear could be induced to listen in the place between music and speech. The melody softened the crowd into a hush without anyone thinking of it as a command. People gathered as they always did at curiosities, at a man slicing sugar into butterflies, at a boy performing tricks with a string, and the banner with its labor of revival unfurled like a map. The first brushstrokes took Mai Lin's breath away. The forbidden blue opened like a secret chamber. It slid along the silk and pooled in the dragon's eye, catching a light that seemed not to belong to that hour's thin sun. The vermilion she laid around it, prepared by Madame Jo in a mixture of safer reds and mordants, answered the blue with a warmth the banner had not known since its creation. When the two colors met, a tiny heat, like a breath, seemed to move along the cloth. There was a hush then, not the taut silence of fear but an expectant pause, as if the courtyard itself held its breath. A woman nearest the front, whose face had the mapped weathering of years bending into the light, stepped forward without thinking. Her name was Song Wei, and she sold preserved plums from a cart by the gate. She had seen every festival the courtyard had known. She had a memory for songs and for the exact way vermilion should dance in the sun. Without thinking, she began to sing an old market rhyme, the sort of tune that curved communities into breath. Her voice was cracked but familiar. A wire suddenly struck. One line and the whole market answered, a laugh, the cry of a child watching, a woven echo under the banner's regained gaze. A child darted through the crowd as if the cloth summoned him. He reached up and tried to touch the dragon's eye with a dirty palm. Madame Jo's assistant caught him with an indulgent scold, and the child's small hands came away smudged with blue. The crowd's reaction was immediate and unself-conscious, a collective inhalation of surprise that warmed the courtyard like sunlight. An old man who had not laughed in months clapped once, and then again because the sound surprised him into motion. A pair of women who traded in oil and incense looked at each other and wept. The memory of a festival when their husbands still came home early flickering across their faces. Even a quarrel across a cart stalled for a breath. It was the kind of moment Mai Lin had always hoped for when she labored over pigments, an image that stitched a fracture, a color that tugged at the thin threads of remembering. In the palace, memory had become something domestic and prized, hoarded in chests and cupped like a fever. Here color acted like a public heirloom, a shared document that could be read by the skin. People touched one another's sleeves and pointed back to the banner as if they had been granted a small mercy. Not everyone rejoiced. Merchant Gao, who stood near the shadows of a wine seller's stall, watched with a gaze that was quick to appraise the cost of everything he saw. He saw not salvation, but a threat to the arrangements that kept him secure. The austerity edicts reduced his taxes, but also limited the fabrics he could sell. A revival of taste might open prices and obligations he had carefully hedged. He muttered to a clerk at his side, an audible thread of discontent picked up later by a supervisor who had an ear for the city's small currents. A palace envoy, crisp and thin-faced, lingered too close to the back of the crowd. He kept his expression blank, but his fingers twitched over a small folded paper, the kind that could be slipped into an office and read by powerful men. Mai Lin felt both the sweetness of what she had done and a prickling like lice along her skin. She had expected joy. She had expected small personal recollections, a seamstress finding a remembered shade of thread, an old scholar recognizing a brush stroke like a phrase from a poem. She had not expected witnesses whose livelihoods counted on monotone order, nor the envoy whose blank face had the weight of state. Yet she also understood the strategy. Madame Zhou had chosen a municipal banner precisely because municipal life belonged to the people, and because the palace watched its borders but not its courtyards. If color could be shown to heal simple griefs, perhaps the practice could be normalized. The crowd did more than clap. They took the revived color and made it their own. Vendors began to lift small textiles out of baskets and compare them to the patched vermilion. A woman with a tray of fried sesame cakes wiped a smudge of leftover oil on a cloth and held it to the banner as if testing the color's depth. An old tailor who had been skinny and bent began to hum and invent stitches as he traced the dragon's contour with a thin finger. A teenage boy, whose father had left for the southern roads and not returned, took a scrap of torn linen and earned pennies by offering to stitch a tiny dragon scale into any garment. The banner turned into a focus that redirected scattered lives into one shared motion of astonishment. Madame Zhou moved among the crowd in a way that made Mei Lin's chest widen with gratitude. She had planned, organized, and ultimately been the public face of the restoration, while Mei Lin remained the unseen hand who had touched the color. Madame Zhou's voice was coarse with ages of bargaining, but soft when she spoke to the old tailor, soft when she took the child's hand and wiped blue from his palm. Her instincts were to reassure, to make even an illicit miracle look like an old municipal custom. She smoothed the banner with the practiced motions of a woman who had spent decades teaching cloth how to hold itself. A young musician, catching the mood, flourished his reed, and the tune stretched into something louder and more certain. Mei Lin closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound massage the inside of her skull. She could feel a pound of the old refinery of emotion loosening, a small hope that color could not only restore memory, but bend the daily world back toward pleasure. But there were small signals at the edges that this joy could not remain strictly a private reprieve. Merchant Gao's clerk, taking a measured step away from the gathering, slipped the folded paper into his sleeve and set off. The palace envoy made a small sign with his hand, and a pair of watchmen who had been nearby moved like a shadow across the courtyard's stones. They did not intervene immediately. That would have ruined the show and turned public sentiment. Instead, they watched for names, for signs of origin. They watched for the touch that would give grief a face and a supply chain. An old woman, who mended nets, came forward and offered a scrap of coloring that she claimed matched the restored vermilion. She lifted it reverently, and the crowd murmured approval. Mei Lin felt a prickle of fear. If the color matched too well, someone with an eye trained on trade merchant or inspector could place its origin. The lapis was rarer. It had been purified in a particular way that left a trace like a whispered accent. Jiao had taught her how to lean the mixture into something that would not scream provenance, but in such a public, breathy moment, these subtleties mattered. Mei Lin withdrew slightly, her breath shallow. She understood the morality of small revolts. She knew that each act of restoration fed a web of needs. The men who shipped ore, the women who fermented dyes in coastal vats, the miners who had watched their beaches and hills hollow out. She also knew that the Grand Secretary's logic counted such webs as threats. He had said in an earlier council that subtle feelings could become large and unruly things. He had been right. The courtyard's laughter, which had seemed so pure, was a current that might carry into patterns and plans he could only see as seditious. Still, when Song Wei's voice rose again, and the market sang along, and a ribbon of cloth was offered into a child's hands, Mei Lin felt her mouth curve. For a pocket of time, in this small outside place, color was not punishment or crime. It was the quickening of ordinary life. An old scholar who traveled daily between the city gates and an obscure library approached and said nothing, but let his fingers linger on the banner as if he could read a memory in the weave. His eyes had wetness in them. He bowed briefly to Madame Zhou and then to Mei Lin in a gesture of thanks. Those small acts nourished her like food. At the same time, the palace envoy's folded paper changed hands. A clerk moved away with careful steps, keeping to the alleys. He walked until he reached the broad steps that rose to the Grand Secretary's compound and handed the note to a young official who had been attending audiences that morning. The official's face, when he read the description, tightened like a clamp. He folded the paper back into his sleeve and began to organize a small report. The human chain of observation, so deliberate and efficient in the palace, was as much a weapon as any edict. In the courtyard, the last sound of the reed pipe fluttered, and the banner hung like a newly raised standard. The crowd dispersed slowly, clutching fragments of color and memory like contraband. Mei Lin lingered when the crowd had thinned. She and Madame Zhou folded the banner with a ritual slowness that honored the object's reinvigorated spirit. Madame Zhou patted Mei Lin's hands, her rough palm warm and honest. "You have a steady hand," she said, "not as praise but as a fact." Mei Lin answered with a small smile and a bowed head. Beneath the small stool where Mei Lin had placed her bowl, the bamboo case that held the blue's last crumbs lay hidden. No one would find it now. The immediate evidence, the visible act of restoration, would be all the public had to remember. Yet when Mei Lin walked back through the alley toward the palace, she felt, as Jiao had sometimes described, that color made sound a small ringing in the world. That ring, pleasant as it was, also attracted the ears of those for whom every alteration suggested a rearrangement of the order they had grown rich and safe by holding. As night slid down, the courtyard emptied and a thin rain began to stitch itself through the city. Mei Lin paused at the gate and watched a clerk, not the envoy himself, but a lower man pause under an eave and unroll a scrap of paper to read the report. He did not yet believe himself an agent of destiny. He only believed in doing his duty. The paper was short, banner restored in outer market. Colors not of known manufacture. He folded it and tucked it into his sleeve with the same care merchant Gao had used to conceal his coin. Rain freckled the paper, and the navy ink ran a little like tears. Mei Lin walked on with the knowledge that the small mercy of the day had made the world slightly different, and that difference would demand a reckoning. She did not yet know that a whisper had already traveled to the Grand Secretary's courtyard, an idle clerk, Merchant Gao's complaint, a folded paper. She did not know the speed with which the palace would marshal its suspicion. For now, the market woman's song echoed in her head, and the child's blue smudged hand warmed the memory of what had been done. The banner, folded and carried back to Madame Zhou's modest workshop, would be hidden again. But the evidence had been seen. The proof was public. Color had been restored where everyone could watch. In the days to come, such a moment would be recounted in many different tongues, as an act of civic courage, as an illegal provocation, as a foolish gambit, as a miracle. For Mei Lin, standing under the palace shadow on the way back, the story was simpler and more dangerous. She had given color back to a people who had forgotten how to be vividly alive. She had also given the Grand Secretary an opening to argue that such vivacity was dangerous. The court, with its appetite for stability, would not allow a new appetite to grow unnoticed. That night she unrolled her journal alone by a thin lamp. She wrote a few lines, careful and minute, about the way lapis took the light and the tremor of the child's palm. She recorded the names of the helpers who might be trusted, the faces of the watchmen who had lingered, the unmistakable scowl of Merchant Go. She wrote down the taste of fried sesame cakes, because tonight that taste meant something. The world could be let into pleasure again. And she added, with a small, honest hand, the record of an envoy's presence, a detail that would, she knew, be small enough to be dismissed by some and large enough to be used by others. Outside her window, the city breathed and the rain stitched its small stitches across the slate roofs. Somewhere in the Grand Secretary's compound a servant had placed the folded paper on a table, and the word color lay now like a seed in the soil of a man who lived by pruning. The courtyard's larder still hung